morning to everybody. Really, it is a privileged occasion to have Professor William Street, the renowned scholar of the world, and that was scholar with a mission to have some kind of intercultural dialogue. And much more important, the scholar from Canada, and looking for the way they're looking for how to accommodate the cultures of the Asian and African cultures in a mainstream philosophical literature, and very particularly the way academic philosophy, it is very much is negated, not recognized, and we make a point that there is a need to be worked out and to take the note of the importance and significance of some of the philosophies which are there, which is much more better than where we feel that today the Western political theory is in a crisis. To overcome this crisis, there is a thinkers like indigenous thinkers like Ambedkar, Gandhi, and some of the African philosophers and Latin American writers. Definitely they fill the vacuum, and also they regenerate the very political philosophy. As a specialist in a political philosophy, you know it very well, the liberal theory, where it is located. Now it is realized that it is as founded on a very weak foundation, and there is a need to be reworked for they don't have the insight. Not only they are realizing the multiculturalism, pluralism, minority rights, ethnicity and all, but where Canada take the initiative, very particularly thinkers like Charles Taylor and some of the thinkers, McIntyre and other people, they take initiation and they see that one has to realize not by the liberal capacity or not giving, but by virtue of their cultures, there is some rights will be there, and that way they are giving the way for against the liberalism and collective rights and the communitarian kind of rights, and or else they want to rework the whole idea of the liberalism. That is, let me introduce about the Professor Williams, and he is professor at Department of Philosophy, St. Francis Xavier University, Canada, and he is working there from 1902 till the date. And he studied political science, theology, and philosophy in Canada, France, and Germany. Doctorate from the University of Ottawa. Foundations of rights in the political thought in Bernard Bosanquet. Is the very idealistic philosophers, which are very much is negative. He believes that these are the thinkers, they try to offer something that is from the starting point, and he still continuity with the today. It is taking some other thinkers like that, Jacques Martin, and there he taking some other royal foundations of the rights within it goes not individualistic kind of the liberalism, and also see some kind of collective space you want to provide. And in the areas of interest, we think, especially political philosophy, particularly on issues of human rights, philosophy of religion, influence of science and technology and religion. Broadly, his major work is that religious belief, he looks for the epistemology of the religion and relations of the culture and tradition of philosophical thinking compared to Asian and Western philosophy and ethical theories and applied ethics. And this way, he defends the positivist theory of the idealistic ethics. He defends broadly Martin's view of dignity and human rights in number of his writing. He has major contributor for international programs of the Council of Research in Values and Philosophy. It's quite often they are organizing seminars and connecting to intercontinental, and they're connecting the academic philosophy in a different perspective. And he authored many books. One of the very few books is that Response to the Enlightenment, an exchange on foundations, faith and community, and religious belief, contemporary debate, religion, science and non-science, and idealism, rights, and this is the University of America Press. Then more than this, he has nearly 25 books, and very popular books are Before and After Democracy, Philosophy, Religion and Politics, What is Intercultural Philosophy, Cultural Clash and Religion, and Migrating Tastes and Traditions. And apart from, here are some of the books under the preparation, and also he has engaged with some of the agencies. One is that British idealism and Indian philosophy in preparation, that is British idealism in South Africa. We can understand this thing is area of interest, how we extended to look at the idealistic traditions from both India and also Africa. And of course, I believe the idealism which is popular, is slightly deviated from that's what I believe it. We're talking about the rights and other things. Definitely, one has to take a different kind of route. Otherwise, idealism has its own kinds of problem. And returning to ethics and moral philosophy and constitutive communities. And apart from this thing, he's a visiting professor for the many universities in the Poland, Taiwan, Australia, and in India also he has for quite long time. He's associated with India, he's coming here familiar with the kind of cultural philosophical traditions of India. And there is a visiting professor for the comparative philosophy of Pune and philosophy of religion where Dharmaram Vidyakshetram Bengaluru. And more than that, he is also the vice president of the member of the Board of Studies Council for Research in Values and Philosophy. And actually, he is the chair committee on intercultural philosophy, Federation of International Society of Philosophy. And very few lines only I try to mention here, but his identity is much more than this thing, much more than this commitment and concern is much more important. Today he came here all over India, he has selected nearly 10 lectures out of this thing. We believe we took the two of the important lectures which I believe. One is that identity, culture and recognition. The other one is the forgotten philosophy. He is talking about identity, culture and recognition in the context of the debate of the Charles Taylor and the Habermas. And as you know, today we are living the day of identity politics, and where identity politics has a meaning where the certain cultures and the faiths and experiences are negated or marginalized or subverted or being subordinated to dominant discourses. The people asserting themselves and their identity is there. It is also identity is located in a culture and much more than this thing, it is related to other, and it is also people are asserting for identity to get the recognition and all. When you are not recognized or misrecognized, there is a harm to the particular. There the importance it is there and all. Many people try to discuss identity refers to the capacity for self-reflection and awareness of self. It is a kind of selfhood. Collective identity explains how structural inequalities get translated into subjective discontent. Identity describes many dimensions and dynamics of protest. Identity makes sense of the world. Identity constitutes in and through making stance of morality. Identity makes functional role in any social domain. Charles Taylor explains identity not mainly from a moral stance, but also provides alternative modernist view against the dominant Western liberal position. The liberalism of equal dignity seems to have assumed that there are some universal principles and also difference-blind principles where they don't want to either acknowledge or recognize the differences among the people. The blind liberalism of themselves are reflections of particular cultures, not only blind to others, it is also want to establish certain cultures from their own way. They try to look at the whole philosophy and they construct it. My own identity crucially depends on dialogical relations with others, and that way identity also demands recognition. Our identity is partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often misrecognition of others. So a person or a group of people can suffer real damage and real distortion. Non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm, can be form oppression, imprisoning someone in a false and distorted and reduced mode of being. And that's why Franz Fanon told, to speak is to assume culture. And there the crux of the whole, the Charles Taylor also taken from, one can see the spirit of that one. And identity is also one kind of reasoned choice where Galleri and others try to say. The next lecture will be on the forgotten philosophies. Yes, today mostly the philosophies mediated text and figures of the philosophy. And the kind of, today we know it very well, certain philosophy, very dominant positions are very much is reflecting in the name of the Indian philosophy. We know the whose positions are introduced. Similarly, in the West also, there are certain philosophical traditions, they engage or they emerge, mostly British idealism or which are philosophies centered in allied philosophy and America and other kinds of philosophy. Today there are questions are there. It is they're talking about African Americans, the feminists, Latin Americans, and Africans and Asian countries. They're asking what is our philosophy, where is our philosophy? Our philosophy is totally missing in the pages of the history of the philosophy. You are not acknowledged, not even recognized. These are the philosophy. That your canons are not allowing to see that the philosophies are there, and then in the context, it is totally today in the context of the identity politics, the assertion of some of the marginalized sections, and they compelled to take note of these things and all. Your philosophies, however rational and rigorous scientific, and it is not have concern for fellow human beings, and there is also totally neglect of others. In this context, there is a folk philosophy, ethno philosophy, philosophy of aborigines, and similarly in the Indian context, you know it very well, Dalits and Adivasi, they try to say this thing, the different rich cultural resources are there. In this context only, we are introduced the course, critical traditions of Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy not only Vedanta centric and idealistic centric, there is also philosophies of this country much more naturalistic and rationalistic and much more accommodative and kind of pluralistic cultures are there, and more than that thing, it is democratic culture. It is this kind of culture one has to bring into the view. There, you try to mention about what it is there. It's a forgotten philosophy, not only forgotten philosophy, it totally neglected behind this neglection that our politics are involved. I believe that one it is there. It doesn't mean that there's a, I will end with this thing, with the Ngugi wa Thiong'o is an African writer, Kenyan writer, he says the thing. It is not the question of substituting one center for the other. The problem arises only when people try to use the vision from any one center and generalize it as a universal reality. Today, yes, exactly, we are contesting that one, and let us have the flourish the different cultures and philosophies. Then only we can have the different world rather than totalitarian and homogeneous kind of cultures and philosophy. Now, I request the Professor William Speed, he will take over and he will continue his lecture.
Also thank the Department of Philosophy for agreeing to welcome me and for providing support and hospitality. I visited the department here, I think about 2001. This was when Professor Bach was chair. I didn't actually spend much time on campus. I just went to see him and talk about a few things. That was good. I've come to Delhi before I spoke at St. Stephen's College some years ago. But this is my first time really on the campus of Delhi University. And it's very nice to be here and have a chance to speak to you. I have two papers that I was asked to present today. When I saw that initially I was to be speaking from 10 o'clock until 1:30, I thought, I don't know if I could do that, and I don't know if I could expect anyone else to do that. So I'm going to give, maybe I'll call them about two 50-minute, roughly 50-minute, 55-minute talks. Maybe we can have some questions after each talk and a break in between, just so people can relax themselves. The two papers I want to speak about today, maybe said to fall broadly speaking in the philosophy of culture. But they are also very different papers from one another. The first takes up a theme discussed by a number of political philosophers, in part as philosophers around the world try to adjust and try to address the challenges that arise in states and globally that are an outcome of the awareness of cultural, including ethnic and religious, heterogeneity and diversity. The second paper that I want to talk about is not so much a paper in political philosophy, it's really more one on the history of philosophy. And it looks at the question about how philosophy is taught and studied, but also about how we think of it. And I think that the way that we think of philosophy bears on how we do philosophy, not just how we do the history of philosophy, but the kind of resources that we draw on. Now, in fact, there are many of these so-called forgotten philosophies. I'm going to talk about some Western forgotten philosophies. I'm also going to mention briefly some Asian forgotten philosophies. But when you think of the map of modern philosophy, when you think of the map of contemporary philosophy, there's a suggestion in which this is really all that philosophy is. And what I want to do in my second talk is challenge the general perception about philosophy. So, the first talk that I want to say something about is this idea of identity, culture, and recognition. And I think that one of the challenges in the modern democratic state is, well, what place should there be for the recognition of culture and cultural identity? When we talk about the recognition of culture and cultural identity, how does this fit with the idea of a national culture? So a Canadian culture or an Indian culture, for example. Or when we talk about identity and recognition, are we really not thinking beyond national cultures to talk about cultural pluralism or multiculturalism? So I think this question is something that has arisen the more that we become conscious of the diversity in our world, and has led to a number of political philosophers and philosophers of culture to try to find some way of finding out what is exactly is the place of cultural identity and culture in the modern state. So this paper is just going to offer a little bit of a survey of some of the work that's been done in the area, and maybe also make a suggestion about how to move ahead in that area. And I'll be very interested in your questions and comments on this. So, first of all, what I want to do is I want to give a brief statement of what people might call the modern liberal democratic view, and present how it understands the place of culture and cultural identity. And then I want to consider one response to that modern view, a view that might be called, for lack of a better word, communitarianism. This has already been referred to in the introduction. But then in response to communitarianism, there is also what we might call a postmodern liberal democratic response. That's the kind of view that you find in authors like Jürgen Habermas. But I want to argue that these three views, all of these views, although they have something interesting to say, they neglect some key questions on the nature of identity and, by extension, on the nature of culture. And it's only by being more attentive to these key questions that we can arrive at a plausible and practical statement of the place of cultural identity and culture in the modern democratic state. So first of all, let me say something about what I would call the modern view. Much of the current work on the issue of the recognition of culture and cultural identity refers implicitly or explicitly to what I call the modern view. And this is a view that I think you can find in what is probably the most influential volume of political philosophy in the last part of the 20th century, and that's John Rawls' Theory of Justice. Now, in that work, as many of you know, Rawls was trying to answer three questions. First of all, what kind of liberal state should we have, or what kind of state should we have? Second, what kind of principles should it follow? And third, how are individuals to lead their lives within this state? Now, Rawls' answer to the first question is the following, that we try to find a kind of state that follows principles of justice that a person would select blindly and without bias. This modern view is influenced not just by people like Locke, but I think more particularly by people like Kant. It doesn't seek to derive the state or the principles of justice from human nature, and it seeks to avoid depending on an all-encompassing theory of the good. So in this way, the modern view holds, we can have a justification of the state without any kind of metaphysical foundationalism and without having to settle any metaphysical issues. So, this view understands human beings as free, as rational, as self-interested but mutually disinterested. It understands them to be autonomous and to have a sense of justice, but it also understands them basically as individuals. And I think this is a key assumption. Individuals who find themselves in what Rawls calls an original position and behind a veil of ignorance. And from that perspective, they would reason themselves to, they would come up with two basic principles of justice. So what are these principles of justice? Again, this is something that perhaps many of you are familiar with. The first principle is the following. Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties, compatible with a similar liberty for all. This is called the liberty principle. And these basic liberties are political liberties, liberties like freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, and so on. But sometimes Rawls recognizes It's useful to have inequalities, that sometimes inequalities in income and wealth produce greater incentives, and everybody benefits from that. And so, as you know, Rawls has a second principle, and that is that social and economic inequalities, not basic liberties, but social and economic inequalities, are to be arranged in such a way that, first of all, they are to the greatest advantage of the most disadvantaged. This is called the difference principle. And that these inequalities are attached, he says, to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And so this way, everybody has a chance from benefiting from the potential inequalities. If people didn't have a chance to benefit from the inequalities, well then obviously they would feel excluded from the whole process. Now, there are many assumptions in this account. There are assumptions about the original position, there are assumptions about the veil of ignorance, there are assumptions about the kind of information behind this veil of ignorance, and concerning the concept of the person who is deliberating and deciding. But I'm not going to go into the details about this. This is something that's been talked about by a lot of people. And besides, it distracts me from what I think my major interest is in this. Now, what this modern view claims about these principles of justice is that given the circumstances of their origin in Genesis, these principles are neutral, and they allow for a neutral state that all people can accept, regardless of their actual background. So specifically, this modern view, this kind of Rawlsian view, holds that these principles establish certain basic rights and obligations, which everyone has. And there are both negative rights, that is, freedoms from having to do things, but also positive rights, freedoms that allow you to do certain things. Although Rawls would not say that there are any natural rights in this respect. Another thing about this view is that these rights indicate a general equality. So there's an equality before the law. It talks about the importance of freedom. So, for example, freedom from discrimination. But this modern view also talks about the importance of a general respect and dignity of all human beings. But one of the things about Rawls' view, by not having a dominant conception of the good, is it allows for all human beings to pursue their own sense of the good in their own way, so long as the basic principles of justice are respected. And so thus we have a view that is pluralistic, it's individualistic, but it's also universal, in the sense that these principles apply to all, and they're principles that in principle all have agreed to. So these principles provide for a broadly democratic state, and it's just working on the hypothesis that you need a state for these principles to have an effect. But this state is something that is based on consent, it aspires to be neutral, and it's something to which a person has certain obligations. So you have political obligations, an obligation to respect the law, to pay taxes, and so on. But nevertheless, whatever these obligations are, is they're limited by these two basic principles of justice, this sort of liberty principle and this difference principle. Now, admittedly, these principles in this state excludes certain kinds of discussion in the public sphere. So, for example, it excludes violent discussion, it excludes violent behavior, it excludes the irrational, it excludes the sectarian, and it excludes, Rawls would say, the religious. So perhaps this view is not absolutely neutral. But nevertheless, Rawls would say that this view does not and should not have a dominant conception of the good. That is, a thick, substantive conception of the good. It doesn't have broad collective goals. That is, goals that are more than a sort of individual good. So what follows from this modern view concerning the recognition of cultural identity and culture? And I think that this kind of Rawlsian view, although it doesn't deal explicitly with the idea of culture and cultural identity, it's pretty clear how they would respond. They would say that individuals have rights, individuals have equal rights, regardless of their culture or conception of the good. If they live or wish to live in a cultural or ethnic or religious community, they can. But they can't expect the state to support or protect cultures except indirectly. That is, so far as these communities reflect a liberty or right guaranteed by the two principles. It is not the role of government to dictate a particular conception of the good or a particular culture. It's not the job of the state to sort of require a certain way of life. Or if it is the role of government to be involved in sort of providing parameters for ways of life, it's in the narrow sense of simply ensuring that the principles of justice are recognized and respected. And so throughout, this modern approach is interested in a priority of liberty, so that individuals can, all things being equal, pursue their own good. So consider, for example, so-called language rights. Can a state promote the use of a language in order to help or preserve a culture? Can it require that citizens be prevented from sending their children to schools that teach in another language? And the response of this modern view would be no. To force people to do that would be to impose a conception of the good on individuals. Or again, suppose we were to argue that providing access to or making mandatory public education would be corrosive to a group's cultural beliefs and practices. So forcing people to take public education that might challenge some of their cultural beliefs, you might say, erodes that culture. So could you say, well, the state can't, have that kind of public education system? Well, Rawls would say no. He thinks that such a state could have such a system. It's a basic liberty to have access to at least a basic education that allows all human beings to be free and democratic citizens. Anything that would restrain individuals from becoming free and democratic citizens violates that first principle, that principle of liberty. Now, Rawls doesn't deny the importance of culture, because he doesn't deny that people have comprehensive conceptions of the good. But the structure of society should not privilege any one conception. So in short, while one can recognize culture and cultural identity in the sense of taking note of it, we recognize that there is diversity out there. Neither culture nor cultural identity has a particular force or status concerning the rights or liberties or the exercise of justice. Culture and cultural identity are matters of private preference and arrangement, not of public determination. Now, of course, a number of questions arise with this modern view of the democratic state and its underlying principles of justice. You might ask, is this view reasonably sufficient for a person to pursue his or her own good? That is the sort of parameters, are they good enough to allow different individuals to pursue their own good in their own way? Can all members of society flourish in such a context? Are there other values that seem to be left out of the discussion? And is this kind of view practical or practicable in a multicultural society? Needless to say, many people have been dissatisfied with the implications for culture and cultural identity in this kind of modern view. One of the major criticisms of this view and its consequences for culture and cultural identity can be found in what has been called communitarianism, and also in the work of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. So I'm going to move now from that modern view to a communitarian view. Now, Taylor would not want to be called a communitarian. And many of those who are often categorized as communitarians, Taylor or McIntyre, Walter, people like that, would have strong disagreements with others who are often placed in that category. But for this paper, I'm not going to worry about specifically who falls into this category. I'm just going to take this view as following the kind of description I'm going to give. In an influential essay entitled The Politics of Recognition, Charles Taylor considers the modern view, that is the view that I've just been talking about, reflecting Rawls, as reflecting a kind of politics of universalism. Now, this politics of universalism is not new with Rawls. We see it from the 18th century in figures like Kant and in various declarations of rights. But Rawls, according to Taylor, provides a contemporary and masterful statement. And so Taylor, I think, has in mind in his remarks how to challenge Rawls' modern view. Now, this modern view with its politics of universalism provides some important values and principles. It talks about the importance of individual freedom and autonomy. It talks about the importance of equal dignity, of equal rights and equal citizenship. It talks about the importance of non-discrimination. And it insists that these rights and values are possessed by all. This is that modern view. But Taylor argues this modern view is incomplete and distorted. Even though it is in a way based on the value of the individual and individual choice, this politics of universalism ignores difference and the value of difference, and it's glossed over individual differences. Moreover, this modern view that Taylor is challenging refuses to engage or address key aspects of the life of the individual, such as the nature of the good life, the value of cultures, ethnicities, and religions, and also the importance of the search for or the vision of the good life a good life that must be sought in common. We don't just pursue the good life by ourselves, we do it as part of the community. And so while this kind of modern view seeks some kind of equal dignity, it places dignity in the context of the individual and not in terms of a larger group. So ironically, perhaps, although the modern view professes to be promoting equality, by not recognizing difference, it doesn't actually respect equality. Or again, while this modern view claims to be neutral, this modern view actually reflects a culture, call it the liberal culture. And it reflects values, call them liberal values. And so it's actually particularist and somewhat discriminatory. So in place of this modern view, then, Taylor offers a model that recognizes difference and specifically that recognizes identity. It's a model that is conscious of the human being as a social and historical being. It's conscious of the human being as a fundamentally social being related to other beings, embedded in, informed by a culture. It's a model that recognizes collective goods, and thus it's also a model that recognizes culture. So what exactly is Taylor's communitarian or multiculturalist alternative? Well, first, Taylor would say that this view holds that difference is important to individual identity, to who and what a person is. And so a society that purports to respect the individual not only should, but must respect difference. Second, this view also argues that recognition and recognition as an equal is necessary to individual identity. Some people feel or they are marginalized and have deprecating self-images, and in order to be free of this kind of inferior self-image or this sense of a lack of your self-image, you need respect and recognition as an equal. Third, this view holds that culture is important to individual identity, not just because individuals say it's important, but because it actually is important. So Taylor says that culture is what people have made of their potential as individuals. Moreover, a person shares in the collective identity because of her culture. And further, persons are concerned about the survival of their culture. And so Taylor says, and this is a quote from The Politics of Recognition, he says, all human cultures that have animated whole societies over some considerable stretch of time have something important to say to all human beings, not just people in that culture, but to all human beings. And thus, Taylor says, all cultures, or at least what he calls all actually evolved cultures, cultures that exist over time, are worthy of respect. Taylor pushes this view even further. He says, we must presume an equality of cultures. Otherwise, we deny fundamental values of equality. And so everyone should enjoy the presumption that their traditional culture is valued. And so the state needs to recognize the equal worth and the equal value of different cultures, but not simply by letting them survive, not just sort of being hands-off. You actually have to do more than that. And so since all cultures then are at least prima facie equal and worthy of respect, the state must concern itself with culture. And as appropriate, so for example, when a culture is threatened, it can and must intervene in areas concerning culture and cultural identity by promoting collective goods. So the state must be active in involving, by engaging in the promotion of collective goods and ensuring cultural survival. So if we're to go back to the example of language rights, Taylor says that powers can be given to collectivities, such as the state, to promote language rights, collective language rights. A state can regulate who can and who cannot send their children to schools in a certain language. It can regulate commercial signage. It can regulate a variety of activities because it contributes to a collective good. And so the rights that it may restrict in doing so are not really basic rights. What you're doing in places you're talking about something that's more important to have a collective value. The state can also aim, Taylor says, to create members of a community. So in other words, it can actually, again, pursue that kind of collective good. Even if, in so doing, it limits certain procedural rights or practices. And Taylor allows that. He says, perhaps this is not strictly speaking a cultural right, but it's a fundamental value, and so the effect of this kind of direction is very strong. So for Taylor, then, culture as cultural difference is important because it's part of one's identity. And a person's right to recognition means recognizing that difference in the value it has. Consequently, cultural identity, culture, and especially minority cultures can be promoted within certain limits, that is, limits of basic rights, recognizing that these basic rights are actually rather few. So one doesn't have, for example, a right to a language in one's own language just because you want to do it. You have to be thinking about it in terms of a larger collective good. Moreover, I think the account that Taylor provides seeks to address concerns such as the redress of past injustices. So how, for example, do we deal with colonialism? How do we deal with discrimination? If we're just following that sort of liberal model, that modern model, we're not providing much opportunity to provide that kind of compensation. So in order to guarantee the presence and possibility of supporting the flourishing of culture, to promote multiculturalism and so on, we need a more robust basis, and this is the kind of vision I think that Taylor's offering us. Thus, the recognition and protection of identity, culture, and cultural identity are essential in the modern democratic state for Taylor. And so we have a kind of multiculturalism, that is something that recognizes difference and that ensures a certain amount of openness. Now, there are a number of issues that have been raised here, though. Does Taylor's approach exclude new cultures from recognition? So remember, he talked about established cultures, he talked about the cultures that had a certain kind of longevity. What about new cultures? Does this view have the correct balance between universals like freedom, that you find in the politics of universalism, and balanced with the particularities of culture, diversity, ethnicity, class, and so on that are reflected in the politics of difference? Could the emphasis on preserving culture and on recognizing difference lead to a kind of apartheid? That is, might that concern about protecting minorities be so strong that you would prevent minorities themselves from sort of expanding beyond their borders? You want to preserve that kind of thing. So is there almost a kind of support for a version of apartheid in all this? So these are some of the questions I think that have been raised, and they led to a significant response. And the responses come from what I would call postmodern liberalism. And this is the kind of view that I think, as I'll say in a minute, I think that you find in Jürgen Habermas. So shortly after the publication of Taylor's Politics of Recognition, we have a response from Jürgen Habermas, which was published in the Stanford Law Review. Now here Habermas turns to the same question of what is the place, or what place should be given to the recognition of culture and cultural identity. Now, given Habermas's Frankfurt School background, you might have expected it to be very much like Taylor's, but it's not. Habermas offers a position between modern liberalism and communitarianism. Habermas recognizes the importance of culture and cultural identity, but he seeks to find a way that recognizes them without having the state explicitly intervene in order to protect them. So interestingly, like modern democratic theory, Habermas holds that the recognition of equal individual rights is sufficient to allow and provide some guarantees for cultures to exist and to coexist, and that there's an individual right to cultural membership. There are then no collective rights of cultures, and particularly there's no right to culture or cultural protection that goes beyond the rights of individuals. So for example, Habermas argues that the Islamic traditions of Turkish immigrants in Germany cannot take priority over the rights of young women in those immigrant communities to participate in public education. So you can't say to young women, you can't take advantage of public education because it might challenge the kind of culture or cultural tradition you come from. Habermas says, collective rights, hedging collective identities, cannot supersede or violate legally established individual rights. Now Habermas offers two arguments for this, at least two arguments for this. The first is not really developed, I think, explicitly, but it's there, and that is that collective rights violate legally established individual rights. And that's the end of the story. If you're going to violate legally established, constitutionally protected individual rights, you're going to violate that, you've got a problem. The second, though, I think that Habermas points out, is that really it's impossible to preserve cultures in an open and pluralist society. If you have an open society, you really can't preserve cultures. You can't preserve cultures like you preserve animals in a zoo. You know, you take animals and put them in a zoo, you put barriers around them, you might think you're preserving them in some way. Well, individuals are not like that, Habermas says. So, new individual members of these communities must have the power to be free to decide if those communities are worth preserving. And they should be free to break with their own tradition. They should be free to challenge that tradition. So Habermas adds that this commitment to individual rights does not put him in the modern or the Rawlsian camp, because although rights are ascribed to individuals, the individuals to whom they are ascribed are social individuals. So, for example, he says that if I'm going to have private autonomy, I really have to be able to participate in public life. And if I'm going to pursue private interests, I'm not just alone in my private sphere, I have to also be engaged in the public sphere. So there's no real difference ultimately between a private sphere and a public sphere. We're social beings. So our identity as individuals is an identity of social individuals. Thus, so-called communitarians are somewhat sympathetic to that view. But what Habermas would say is that there is indeed a right to cultural membership. There's indeed a right to cultural membership, but nevertheless, these rights to cultural membership don't entail collective rights. They don't entail cultural rights. So, given this robust view of the individual in this postmodern view, we don't need collective rights. Moreover, because individuals are fundamentally independent, there really can't be collective rights. And finally, even if there is a right to cultural membership, this culture should not define the political culture. That is, there should be a decoupling of the majority culture from a political culture. So cultural or collective identities are important, but they lead to conflict. And so we need to separate subcultures or collective identities from the political culture or civic identities. And so Habermas writes, the national legal order, although ethically impregnated in terms of the political culture, shared equally by all citizens, must remain neutral with respect to these pre-political forms of life and traditions. So rather than having a basic commitment to one's culture, there needs to be a commitment to something else that makes social life and social discourse possible. And this is something that Habermas calls constitutional patriotism. So we're not loyal to a national culture, we're not loyal to a dominant culture, we're loyal to the Constitution, and that's where our patriotism lies. So this involves a certain measure of political socialization, he says, about adopting the terms and conditions of a modern democratic self-understanding of the community. Immigrants must be obliged to assent to the Constitution, and not to the point of assimilation, but a person who moves into a new society has to recognize these are the constitutional rules that are in place. Once an immigrant becomes a citizen, that individual can try to change that Constitution. But at the end of the day, that Constitution still has to kind of respect those principles of openness and diversity that separates the political constitution from cultural identity. So culture and cultural identity are important. Habermas recognizes the place of culture, but he would not want to exaggerate or overstate that place. After all, a culture may have little value, or may lead to conflict, or may limit rights. So while there's no collective right to culture or to the survival of a culture, and no fundamental collective rights of cultures, there are legal individual rights under what he calls an equal protection clause to cultural membership. And so Habermas says, this is a quote from his text, everybody has the same right to develop and maintain their identity in just those intersubjectively shared forms of life and traditions from which she first emerged and which has been formed during the course of childhood and adolescence. But of course, one also has the right not to develop or to withdraw from that culture. And so there's a kind of recognition of culture, of the value of culture, but there's no right of that culture to limit individual choice. Now, this kind of postmodern, non-foundationalist solution is troubling to some because they say it really doesn't take culture seriously enough. That is, that it ignores its extensive role of culture in relation to the life of the individual person, and that it suggests that culture is, in a sense, something chosen. And this is something I'll come back to in a minute, but sometimes people would say, if you take a liberal view, it's like people can choose to be members of a culture, or can choose not to be members of a culture, as if it's purely within their control. And this has been challenged by some people, that we can't just choose to be a member of a culture, or choose to leave that culture. Moreover, one might well ask, what exactly is a right to cultural identity? What does that mean to talk about a right to cultural identity? This notion is rather vague. If a right to cultural identity is the right to get together with other people to be involved in a culture, that's nice, but that doesn't give much substance to it. So is a right to cultural identity enough to protect and preserve cultural identity? So where does this leave us? Well, what I want to say is that all of these three views actually make certain assumptions. And I'm going to, first of all, challenge those assumptions and then provide a little bit of an alternative to that. So I think in the preceding accounts, the main reasons for the recognition of culture and cultural identity, the main reasons even for the talk about the possible rights to culture, is that culture is a necessary part of individual identity. What's not clear is why exactly this, that it's part of individual identity, is sufficient for cultures to have special recognition or protection or special rights. Now I want to propose a reason why cultures might actually have this kind of claim, and that given that kind of explanation, we can go back to that question I set out at the beginning of the paper, and that is what exactly is the place of culture or cultural identity in the modern state. But I think that we actually need a fourth option, that the three that we've looked at just haven't done the job. So I want to make very briefly some comments, first about identity, second about recognition, and then I'm going to offer a little bit more of my own view here. Identity is a notoriously vague and puzzling notion. A standard account of identity of the contemporary democratic citizen would have many, if not all, of the following characteristics. Standard account of identity would say there are characteristics of human beings which are universal, call them characteristics related to human nature. There are elements which are general, that is to say they reflect social issues, social relations, and so on. And there are elements which are particular. So by universal I mean the following. We can think of individuals as being free, as being equal, as being rational, self-interested, having a conception of the good, being able to communicate, being able to work with one another, being historical beings, being social beings, being embedded in culture, having a past, present, and an expectation of the future. Universal characteristics would include certain kinds of universal goods. We all seek life at some level. We all seek security, we seek friendship, we seek knowledge, we seek peace, we seek maybe the spiritual life or aesthetic experience. And so there are certain elements of an individual that you look at that you can say, these are characteristics that you would find in individuals everywhere. That there is a desire for certain kinds of goods, and there are certain traits of human beings that you find in all cultures. And so what one looks for is one looks for in an individual someone who has these universal traits, but also has a systematic way of organizing those traits. So a way of organizing your wishes and your wills and your hopes and your expectations and so on. But there's this another element to an individual in a modern democratic state, and I call these general elements. And what I mean here is that every universal has to be made concrete. That is to say, every universal must take place in particular here and now. So, we all have a conception of the good, but in this place, you will share a certain conception of the good with other people, people who are like you. In this place, you are part of this society, you are part of this family, you are part of this culture, you are part of this social class, and so on. And so, these universal principles by themselves don't really do anything for you. They have to be instantiated in particular places at particular times. And that's why culture is so important. Culture is the instantiation of some of these universal principles in a material world. But of course, there are also things that are particular or unique to one's identity. These are the things that distinguish me from you, or me from people who are like me. So for example, I have my history, I have my conception of the good, I have my character, my memory, my word, my job, my relationships, and so on. So when we're thinking about the identity of an individual, we think about traits that you could call universal traits, the traits that you could call general traits related to society and culture, and particular traits. But identity, as Taylor reminds us, needs more than just simply having these traits. Identity needs recognition. So let me say a few words about recognition. Like the idea of identity, this notion of recognition is sometimes a bit vague, a bit ambiguous. Recognition can simply be the capacity to take note of somebody. So I see somebody in the hallway, or I see Dr. Mercy Valenitis. I saw her before in Istanbul about 15 years ago, so I recognize her. I just see her, so I take note of her. But recognition can also mean to provide someone with a benefit, to approve of someone or to give someone a title. So when you come to a meeting, you might recognize a speaker. So, I recognize this person. I recognize this person. Which gives that person a title to then stand up and take the floor. So in a way, recognition can also involve placing a value on someone, or assigning a value to someone or something. Now, there may be certain processes required for recognition. This is a big story. But recognition, my point is recognition is not something passive. It's not just something that just happens. It's something that is active, and it's something that is critical. That is, you can have reasons to recognize someone, and you might have reasons not to recognize someone. So, recognition is something that is subjective, but it's intersubjective in that way. So I need others to recognize me. I need others to maybe recognize the kinds of goals or ends that I pursue in life. I need my family to recognize me. My family recognizes me perhaps as a son, or as a father, or as a spouse, that kind of thing. But I need my society at large to recognize me as well. Specifically, for example, I need a recognition of what is universal in me. I need a recognition of my freedom and autonomy. And so people will often talk about this recognition of myself as a free and autonomous being is to be found in things like rights to life, or rights to security, or rights to conscience, or rights to religion, and so on. There's also, of course, a recognition of what is particular about me. So I need to be recognized as the father of this child, or the professor of this course, and that kind of thing. It's something that's very particular. But I also need a recognition of what is general about me, and that is to say, I need a recognition about my place within culture. And so, in short, what I need is I need a recognition not just of the universal traits of me, not just of the social traits of me, I need a recognition also of the particular traits of me. This is not simply to add on to my identity. Taylor rightly talks about the importance of negotiating our identities. And so you can sort of think about a child growing up and how the child interacts with parents or with other children or whatever. They're trying to find out who they are, and they find out who they are by their relations with others. They don't just sort of have their identity and then someone just recognizes it. Identities are negotiated. And so it's not just the particular elements of my life, it's even the recognition of the universal elements of my life that have to be negotiated in some way. So I think this says something about that notion of recognition. Now, given this description of identity, given this description of recognition, we have some clues as to whether and why we should recognize cultural identity. So, one thing we do is we recognize someone's individual identity and someone's cultural identity because it's part of what it is to be a person. If I don't recognize your cultural identity, if I don't recognize your difference, I'm not recognizing you. But there must be something more to the value of culture than just the fact that it's part of an individual. So the value of a culture is not just relative to an individual's wishes or desires or sense of self. In fact, I think this is one of the problems with all of the three views that I've talked about. Culture is valuable because it is fundamental in organizing human life in general. And so in this sense, culture is like a lot of other basic goods. The good of living in community, the good of the family, the good of religion, and so on. Culture provides an opportunity to call us out of ourselves. And that's an element that we often forget in talking about culture. That culture gives me a sense of obligation. I have an obligation to my culture. In the same way in which I might have an obligation to my family, an obligation to my community, an obligation to my religion. And so culture provides a kind of normative or moral imperative that just isn't dependent upon what I would like. Sometimes I'm called to do things whether I like it or not. And so I think this is something that perhaps an audience in India can appreciate more than an audience in the United States and Canada. Because very often when you think about Indian philosophical traditions, people will talk about notions like dharma, the idea of duty or obligation. And this is something that seems to be left out, I think, of all of these views that I've been talking about. This sort of fundamental role that we don't just have rights, we have obligations. Now, what follows from this approach to culture? I think to begin with, we must recognize that culture not only has a role for our own lives, but but it has a role for others. And if culture is important to others' lives, then we should leave as much space as possible for these other cultures to grow and thrive. So if I think that culture is important, it's not just that it's important for my identity. I have to recognize that it's important for your identity. But by recognizing that it's important for your identity, it doesn't mean to let you do whatever you want. And so again, the recognition of culture is not just that I see it's there, but I have to be able to maybe engage it, talk about it, maybe even question and challenge it. We should also recognize that human beings may participate in a fundamental way in different cultures. So for example, you may be part of a religious group, you may be part of an ethnic group, you may be part of other groups as well. We do not have necessarily just one culture. We have multiple cultures. And then the question arises, well, what happens when these cultures seem to require different things of us? How do we sort of negotiate that kind of thing? And so again, when we talk about cultural rights, these cultural rights can't be absolute because it doesn't help us solve problems when we ourselves are in situations where our different elements of our cultural identity are in conflict. Third, culture is not the only fundamental element or good of one's identity. There are goods that reflect the universal dimension of human identity. Goods that reflect our freedom, our rationality, our seeking of the good. And we have an obligation to seek these goods as well. So it is then this broader sense of obligations that also restrains or limits the obligations that we may have to our cultures. So culture has a claim on us, and we recognize it as a claim on us, but other things have a claim on us too. So the view I'm suggesting here is the answer is not whether there is a right to culture or cultural identity, but what are our obligations to our cultures? What are our obligations to those elements to which our cultural identity is tied? Now it may be that there are fundamental elements of our identity that take priority over elements of our culture. Perhaps because they're more universal, or perhaps because they're equally fundamental. We must not fail to notice the importance of not just the particular and general elements of our identity, but of the universal aspects of our identity. So just as I can be called to sacrifice a particular part of my identity to a more general part, so one part of my identity is the ability to lead my life as I choose, but in time of war, I might be conscripted, I might be called to do military service. Or I certainly like to spend my salary as I choose, but every time I get my paycheck, I notice that the government is getting a certain portion of my money. So I might want to lead my life as I choose, but I recognize that there are these other obligations that are important to me as well. So I can be called to limit or abandon certain cultural practices if it compromises other universal goods. So, thus a young woman may be obliged to have a public education, even if it challenges her culture, and a student may rightly resist being forced to study the dominant language in a community if it interferes with more fundamental rights to education. So I think there is a place for the recognition of culture and cultural identity, but it's not an uncritical recognition. And it's a recognition that is related to other fundamental values that constitute a common comprehensive good. It is what is necessary for individual integrity, I think it's true, but it's also something that recognizes the importance of culture. So what this offers is another way of looking at culture and cultural identity by not focusing on the right to it, but on the obligations to it. It sort of tells us that it's not something that's just entirely within our own choice, but something that we may have to do regardless of whether we like it or not. So let me just very quickly sum up. So in this paper, I sought to raise the question of the place of culture and cultural identity in a modern democratic state by framing it in terms of three dominant models. This is the modern Rawlsian model, this is the communitarian model related to Taylor, and then finally the sort of postmodern model of Habermas. I think there's something of value in the approaches taken by each of these models. There's something that's important there. But nevertheless, there are certain key elements that I think that are missing in these models that we have to pay attention to in order to talk about the importance of culture and cultural identity. First, in all of these cases, I think these three accounts that we've looked at are too individualistic. That is, they focus on the role of culture and cultural identity as fundamentally a part of individual identity. So it's about the individual. I think that's one thing that we might challenge. Second, and perhaps related to this, these three accounts struggle with the value of culture in itself. That is, culture seems to have only an instrumental value on each of these views, because it's valuable to the individual. The question I'm raising is whether culture might have a value in its own right. Third, all the views that we've talked about, that I've talked about, avoid the notion of a genuine common good that provides an explanation or context for the value of culture and cultural identity. It's by reference to a kind of common good, it's an old term, but I'll use it, that I would argue we're able to see the value of the recognition of culture and cultural identity. Now, as a theoretical view, I think the position I offer here goes beyond the approaches I've talked about. But if you're to look at it in a very practical aspect, I'd say it probably lies somewhere between Habermas and Taylor. That is, between being a kind of individual value and a kind of collective good in its own right. So there are no cultural rights as such. And there is no a priori rule about the value of culture or cultural identity. Yet the virtues of cultures, and in principle any culture, may be of fundamental value. Its particular value, however, is in relation to the other values that collectively constitute or comprise a common good. If we keep this in mind, we have at least some answer to the question posed at the start of the paper, namely what is the place, if any, for the recognition of culture and cultural identity in the modern democratic state. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much.
Sweet for taking us through this, exposition of how these concepts of identity, culture, and recognition have passed through in the Western discourse. And you end with your own view about these three very important concepts. And you talk about the normative aspect of culture and how that really gives rise to the idea of an obligation, since it's not that we have a choice or a right to a certain culture, but we are almost like born in a culture, and we therefore willy-nilly have certain obligations, and those obligations would have to take into account the individual traits that one has as well as the universal traits. Now my question is that in accepting such a scheme of things, are you also talking of a higher order obligation, a moral obligation, which could be called the human moral obligation, which takes into account both the universal traits that make us part of the human society, as well as the obligations that we have having our individual identities also. And I say this because I have been working on this concept of the human moral obligation, and I have wondered whether this would be something that would help us confront and resolve some of the problems that definitely would arise when we have a multicultural society and we have the obligations not only towards our own culture, but also cultures which are maybe very diametrically different from ours. So, when you have these kinds of conflicts, can we just talk about an obligation at the cultural level, or should we really go up and talk of a kind of a combined human moral obligation, where the emphasis is more on, the fact that we are social beings, but we are also moral beings, which distinguishes human beings from, non-human animals.
Yeah, the moral obligation is that it seems to be neutral, but it isn't. Right? So if I talk about what is human moral obligation, maybe there's an obligation to the freedom of the individual. But in some societies, the freedom of the individual may not be basic. And so people would say, well, you talk about human moral obligation, but it's really a certain kind of a way of thinking about ethics. It's not universal in that sense. So, I think some people might worry about this. It's not so much a worry for me, because what I would say, and maybe this is your view as well, there are things about me that have to be true wherever I happen to be. So maybe that's the human element there. So I'm a rational being. That's again, I've got the capacity to reason. I've got a capacity to form a conception of good. Whatever that good is, I don't know. But I've got that capacity. I've got a capacity to, in a sense, have some kind of control over some of my activities. We'll call that autonomy and whatnot. Culture is a way of helping me do that in the concrete. So I can't live my life in the abstract. I have to live it in the concrete. So culture gives me guidelines, hints. It helps me learn about my identity in that way. I guess my point is that, so although culture does that to me, and I have an obligation to respect that culture, what happens when that culture is inconsistent with those other values? Not because they're my values, because they're, to use maybe your word, they're human values. So when a culture prevents people from being free, from being autonomous, from exercising their capacities of reason, when a culture does that, what's the value of that culture? Now it may be that cultures grow and develop, and so at a certain point in time, a culture is like a state. It's the best you can do. And so the state's got a value because it's still organizing social life. Okay. But there's some cultures that don't seem to progress, that when novelty is presented to them, the culture just refuses that. So they just say, we want nothing to do with the modern world, we're just going to retreat. I think at that point, that's a culture that is not providing a living option. It's not allowing for those more, what I would call universal principles. And so we can rightly challenge that culture. Is it doing the job that culture is supposed to do? And that's not just a matter of my making that decision, because maybe I'm in no position to make that decision. But there may be people who have insight. Maybe in the Indian context, you think of someone like Gandhi, or in another context, it might be Martin Luther King. Call them almost prophets in some way. These are people who have insight into that. So for me to say, I'm going to reject my culture because I don't like it, who am I? Okay. So that would make it too individualistic, and that's what I'm afraid of when you look at Rawls and Taylor and Habermas, is that it's sort of me making that decision. I think there are principles that are broader, call them human principles, that are part of the culture, and that when the culture conflicts with that, then maybe the culture has to give. Or when one part of my culture conflicts with another part of my culture, something has to give. But it's not up to me in the end. Is that human moral obligation? I'm not sure what I would call it, but it's got a normal in there.
Very important part, but the state should not promote culture to the extent that it has to. So you are actually arguing from a modernist viewpoint, saying that culture is not so essential, but the culture is capable of giving it to him. So if I am thinking that the culture is oppressive, I can choose to move away, sell my animal skins, whatever I used to do before when I was part of a. You are saying that I can move on. I have any other option. So I can be a white man, take a professor's job, or involve myself in other activities which need not promote the identity which I was born with. So I am thinking that this.
That I have obligations to preserve that culture. So let's say I move to a country and I want to teach my daughter in English, but the dominant language of that country is German. Okay. Can I say that, well, I want to preserve my culture, so my daughter is going to learn English? Do I have that kind of control over that? Or do I have to say that, maybe I have to give up to another greater good in some sense? So my point is not so much whether I make that choice. The point is that whether there's, for people like me, not just me, but for people like me, is this a good thing? So if I say that I don't want my daughter to study science because science teaches her things that go against my religion, that should not be my choice. It should not be my choice. My daughter has not an individual right, but she has a collective right, if you could call it this way, to participate in having the opportunity to be a free and democratic citizen. So maybe in that case, my culture yields to not just her individual right, but the general right to be a citizen in a free and democratic society. So, on the other hand, it may be that we're not sure about what the education is going to be like. We're not sure. So I might say, well, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Canadian, whatever. I don't like it, but I'm going to raise my daughter as a Muslim. I don't like it, but I'm going to raise my daughter in the Canadian tradition. You know, maybe I don't like it, but I'm going to do that. So that culture can overrule my individual choices. But the question is, can it always overrule my individual choices? And if they're just individual choices, why not? But if it's not just me, but people like me, a large group of people who say, no, this culture is too oppressive, then I think it's appropriate to change. So if I say that a certain political structure, a certain social structure, a certain religious structure, certain cultural practices don't just cause me harm, but cause a lot of people harm, then maybe that culture should change. But if it's just about me, well, maybe I should get into that culture. So I don't want you to think that it's just about individual choice. I'm trying to avoid that kind of thing. But I do want to say that cultures are not absolute. That if you are born in a certain kind of culture, it doesn't mean that that culture controls everything and there's no opportunity for resisting. Because some cultures are oppressive. Some cultures go against basic values. And so I want to say that some cultures should change. Some cultures should change. But not just because I want them to change.
Similarity between whatever you said as a conclusion and whatever Rawls has said in the form of having the distinction between a private sphere and the public sphere, public use of reason and private use of reason. So is it so? Like, can we interpret your points of view from the spectacles of Rawlsian distinction between private use of reason and public use of reason?
Short answer is no.
No.
No, I think the problem with the Rawls view is that you can make that distinction of public and private. This is Rawls' view. You can make that, and that certain private things shouldn't be public. If you want to do certain things in private, culture, religion, whatever, great. Just don't bring them to muddy into the public because it causes too many conflicts and so on. Now, my view would be is that culture is public. That my religious beliefs, my cultural beliefs, my ethnic beliefs, these are all part of these are as much part of the public sphere as rationality and freedom and so on. The challenge is, how do I deal with the culture? How do I deal with your culture? It's public, so I have to deal with it. It leads to conflict. Also, how do I negotiate that conflict? It's not a matter of individual choice. It's not a matter of individual choice. What is the good of your culture? What is the good of my culture? What is it that it contributes? And then I can start talking about to what extent should certain cultural practices be allowed and what cultural practices might not be allowed. So to take an exaggerated example, female genital cutting. They're immigrants to Canada, they come there, they want to practice their own culture. Should we allow female genital cutting? I know it's a big debate. It's not just about whether one family or one girl or one woman is interested in this. It's not about this. Is this a good? Now you might say, but culture forms who she is. She needs that cultural connection. But there are other elements of her life as well. Her freedom, her sexual autonomy, things like this, that are also important values. We don't say that culture just trumps the individual values and that's it. But we don't say the individual values just annihilate the culture. We have to look at what that cultural practice is. Some cultural practices, it's fine. Other cultural practices that would challenge those other basic elements of human beings, no. But it's not a matter of individual choice. It's not a matter of individual choice. It's what are the goods that we need in society for human beings to grow and flourish. What do we need? We need a culture. We need freedom. We need particularities. We need universalities. And we have obligations to those things. So you might want to say that Because culture makes me who I am. I owe something to my culture. But it doesn't mean I owe everything to my culture. That my culture trumps me at all costs. I guess I would say that. So, no, I really want to not be wrong.
So, because when